The slides?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, excellent. So first, of course, I'd like to thank Charney for for making this possible, for supporting the Charney Resolution Center, for supporting the Charney Forum on New Diplomacy, and for being so active. I'm very happy that Noah is here with us, and I'm also very happy that we're recording it so that I don't have to say it again. What I was asked to speak about is the COVID-19 crisis and the global challenge it created. And in many ways, the coronavirus represents a rare time in the history of mankind that we call a perfect storm. All the things that happened in some sort of a cosmic, circumstances got together, and what we're seeing is the following. We see a global leadership crisis, which means that the idea of elected people running professional systems has its own weaknesses, and we see it today, not only in the United States, where it's the most obvious example, but also in other countries such as Israel. We see a systemic underperformance, which means that entire systems collapse, because you have to understand what happened here is that economists usually were the ones who told us that the global machine can never be stopped, right? That was the power of capitalism. This machine could never be stopped. And look what happened. Not only that the machine stopped, it stopped in a very swift and dramatic way and brought about an economic devastation that is unprecedented. It's much worse than any war that we experienced in recent history. The economic devastation is beyond imagination. We're only now beginning to assess the economic devastation. The coronavirus exposed lack of preparedness. We use a lot the word resilience when we refer to nations and cities. Today we see, perhaps more than ever, that systems were not prepared. Let me just give you one small example from the Israeli system. It turns out that the Israeli system is underperforming in a very severe way when it comes to beds, hospital beds, operational hospital beds per person. We're in fact below the 50% mark, which is required by the OECD. In other words, we have to double the number of beds in order to meet the criteria, the basic average of the OECD members. Governmental ineptitude, we see it all over the place. A big part of governmental ineptitude stems from the fact that there was no sufficient degree of transparency. Just imagine how this whole crisis could have evolved if only the Chinese government had been more transparent to begin with. I'm not saying that they did something wrong with the virus itself. All I'm saying is that the fact that they were not transparent, that they were not communicating with the world, what happened is one of the reasons that it elevated the level of anxiety. And then decision-making in conditions of severe uncertainty is very difficult to do and to maintain and to produce. And we see it again all over the world, how difficult it is to make decisions. We don't know much about the virus. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, information overload. We heard a wonderful lecture from Nick Kahl, by the way, which was co-sponsored by the Charney Forum a couple of nights ago. I think Ali was on that call. And he used the term, which I really liked. He used the term, he said, we use the term social distancing. We also should be using the term informational distancing, which means that there's certain type of information that we have to stay away from. We have to be very, very cautious when it comes to the kind of information that we're allowing ourselves to consume. And the information overload is a significant problem. It really makes a significant contribution to the impairment of the system to make the right decisions. And in many cases, I'm sure you've seen the big scandal and the big drama that was created just by the president of the United States using the word disinfectants, which created a whole storm really, I think, almost unprecedented storm since the beginning of the crisis. Um, a couple words about the world before the crisis. The model that, or more accurately, the contract. There is a social contract. The term social contract became popular in the early 20th century when the labor unions were fighting for the rights of employees, mostly throughout the Western world. It wasn't so much an issue outside of the Western world, but the contract that was designed was very, very clear. The contract was based on the following: the governments were to provide citizens with basic education, physical safety, and health, basic health. That's why, for example, in Israel, most of the hospitals were either governmental hospitals or hospitals that were built by the trade union. Those were the two institutions, the two establishments that were entrusted to keep the contract. That was the side of the government, to provide health, education, and security. The part of the people in the contract was to be productive, to abide by the law, not to break the law, and most importantly, pay taxes, because then the taxes went back to the society and allowed that machine to work. Now, that model, that contract, which was designed in the early 1920s, was based on several assumptions that none of them is still relevant today. The first assumption was that life expectancy, average life expectancy, is going to be around 55. That was the life expectancy at the turn of the century, the previous century. We are now projecting that by 2050, life expectancy is going to be 95. So there's 40% in 150 years. 40 years are added to the calculation. Pension funds, Social Security. So you have to pay those payments 40 years more than your initial planning. That's dramatic. The second thing is, in those days when the contract was designed, only a moderate proportion of the population lived in big cities, meaning density was not such a big issue. By 2050, we project that 75% of world population will live in big cities. Again, no wonder that New York very quickly became the epicenter of the pandemic, because New York is the gateway to America and also one of the most condensed areas in the United States. So when you have high levels of density, you have different issues that you have to deal with, especially when it comes to health, to public infrastructure, and certainly to what we call resilience. And then the job market. Back in the early 20th century, no one even thought about the possibility of an algorithm replacing humans in the job market. It was not even a possibility, it was inconceivable. Well, now we know that this is definitely a process that is happening. A lot of people discussed and analyzed the future of work, how work is going to look like 50 years from now. And guess what happened? COVID-19 actually brought the future to the present. In other words, the future is now. The future of work is now. And you see a big shift to what I call flex economy. Some people call it gig economy, meaning an entire economy that is going to be based on freelancers, people that will, their physical location will not be relevant, people that will be able to acquire new skills very, very quickly, and will be able to work from anywhere. If you would like to have a glimpse into that world, do yourselves a favor and just go online and check two platforms. The first is Fiverr.com, which is an Israeli company. Fiverr.com, which is my favorite outsourcing platform, is the future of work in many ways. And if you want to understand more about the lifestyle that this kind of work allows people to engage in, then go on YouTube and just look for movies that that talk about van conversions or nomadic life. These are people, mostly young people, but not necessarily young people. Young people that take vehicles like an old van or an old truck, turn them into a tiny home, and simply travel. And while traveling, they work from the car. All they need is an internet connection. It's a fascinating phenomenon. And I'm amazed to see that some of those videos have millions of viewers, and they have conventions and they have places where they gather and they learn from each other how to design the car and how to fix all sorts of problems. And they can go off grid for weeks with solar panels and enough water and enough food. And they just have a different lifestyle. They're connected and they're disconnected at the same time. So that model that was designed 120 years ago and promised us a certain equilibrium is no longer sustainable. And it was not going to be sustainable even before the COVID-19 crisis. The COVID-19 crisis only emphasized that there is a need to design a new contract. Now, what's going to happen post COVID-19? One thing for sure, there is going to be a clash between two forces. And I'd like to give you a reference to an article that was published today. I think I sent it to you, Tzili, about the concept of gaslighting. I'll talk about it in a second. But there's going to be a clash, no question about it. What's going to be the issue at hand? On the one hand, we're going to see international forces, perhaps even some governments, that will say COVID-19 was a result of something. It was a result of the way we abused the planet. It was a manifestation of the ongoing, almost never-ending abuse of the environment. The universe was trying to tell us something, and we better listen. All right, that's going to be the message. It's a very powerful message. Resonates with the younger people. And it will, no question, will give boost to the climate change conversation. So people will say, yes, we're going to the new normal, which is, by the way, the new abnormal, right? As Ali said correctly in one of her comments to Nick Call a couple of days ago, she said, it's not just the new normal, it's the new abnormal. And Ali, I'm going to give you credit for that because I think you helped me crystallize a concept.
Thank you. I guess I'm part of that younger generation, the climate change generation, thinking about it.
So one of my predictions is that the climate change conversation is going to be a very, even more prominent than before. But add to that conversation about what we call responsible consumption. We spoke about conspicuous consumption, if you remember, during the last conference last year. At NYU, conspicuous consumption is the kind of consumption that we engage in only because we have money, not because we need it, right? So if I buy a painting, a Picasso for $25 million, it's conspicuous. I don't really need that. There's no real reason for me to spend $25,000 on a piece of canvas, but because I can do it, it's called conspicuous consumption. So there's going to be a shift from conspicuous consumption to what we call responsible consumption. Meaning people will not consume more than they need. And the word responsibility is going to make a very big comeback. Collaboration in international relations, diplomacy, according to those forces, will have to rely on collaboration. It's already happening on the scientific front. If you saw the story that I sent you last week about how scientists and universities are not waiting for governments. They're already engaged in intense collaboration, trying to find vaccination, trying to share information, exchange information. At the end of the day, they will also have to exchange faculty and researchers. And then leaders, corporations, organizations will be expected to remain true to their purpose. So it will not be enough, if you're Apple, it's not going to be enough just to make money for your stakeholders, for your shareholders. This is not going to be enough. You are going to have to prove that you have purpose, and more importantly, that you're able to stay on that purpose for the long haul. What we call the idea that I'm here only to satisfy the appetite of my shareholders is not going to hold anymore. That's what this force is going to say. And lastly, they will say, forget about smart cities, forget about smart living. Let's talk about livable living. Let's talk about how we make sure that technology is not destroying our lives, but rather adding value to our lives, right? Because a lot of the technology that we're using, including the technology that is being used to monitor the spread of the pandemic, is viewed by many of the people that support this side of the argument as damaging technology and technology that that we shouldn't be using. For example, technology that infringes on people's privacy. So this is going to be the narrative of one side of the clash. The other side of the clash is going to have an entirely different narrative. They will say the situation pre-COVID-19 was good for everybody. It was win-win. It was prosperity. The stock market, not only in America, all over the world, did incredibly well. Oil prices were reasonable. We were all benefiting from it. Even the universities, which are the hotbeds for all the radical ideas of the other camp, even those universities are very wealthy, very rich. A lot of people were making fun of Harvard that with its $5 billion endowment fund, they were taking an $8.5 million aid package from the US government last week. So a lot of people made fun of Harvard. So what these people are going to say, that time is of the essence, and that we need to restore the old order very, very quickly, and that the pandemic, the number one agent of the pandemic is globalization and global travel. And from a factual point of view, these people are correct, because amazingly and astonishingly, there is no COVID-19 in remote areas. There is no COVID. We were expecting, for example, COVID-19 to hit Gaza in a very big way and other refugee camps. It's not happening. And the reason is very simple. Apparently, these people are not being, those places are not being frequented by travelers, and therefore the virus hasn't reached those places yet. And so their point is that globalization is the number one agent of the virus, and we need to take care of our own interests first, right? It goes in line with Trump's whole philosophy of America first. So that would give rise to nationalistic sentiments, to tribalism, which in this case will be digital rather than physical. Anti-immigration, we already see that. We just heard that a couple of days ago, President Trump announced that he's putting a freeze on the issuance of new green cards in the United States. And of course, it will give rise to the whole notion of isolationism. Those two narratives are going to clash in the post-COVID-19 world. The article that I was referring to is titled, "Get Ready to the Biggest Gaslighting of the Century." Gaslighting is a term that was created in the 1930s or the 1940s century. It's the process that is meant to convince you that you're crazy, right? So it comes from a play where the main protagonist is trying to convince his wife that she's losing her mind in order to cover up the fact that he was cheating on her. All right, that's gaslighting. And it happens in the relationship between human beings, between parents and their children, between teachers and their students, and so on and so forth. So this writer wrote about how we are going to be gaslighted by the people of this narrative, of the red narrative. So all those big corporations that stood to gain from the old order are going to bombard us with advertisements and messages and arguments why we should restore the old order very, very quickly. And they will try to cover up that this is actually an opportunity to fix some of the biggest systemic problems of our time. Let's take the issue of diplomacy, for example, that we've been talking about. We've been talking about new diplomacy for a long time. And actually, the COVID-19 crisis pushed the diplomatic world by definition to adopt all the solutions that we spoke about, from adapting to digital literacy very, very quickly. All of a sudden, diplomats that did not know how to open their laptop, all of a sudden have to engage meetings, to conduct meetings on Zoom. And that's a simple, basic thing, all the way to what is really the purpose of diplomacy. So this really is a booster to this whole conversation. Now, who's going to win in this clash? We don't know. What I can tell you is, this is not going to be, this is going to be very, very messy, very nasty, and very ugly. In some places, it could even turn into a physical and violent confrontation. Let me give you one example from the case of Israel. If you remember early on when the crisis just erupted, Prime Minister Netanyahu saw this as an opportunity to be in the limelight, right? And to basically grab the attention of the nation every night at 8 p.m. And he presented himself as the person who runs the crisis. He manages the crisis. And he did it for a few nights in a row, 45 minutes to an hour every night. And then all of a sudden disappeared. I don't know if you noticed that. He's not doing that anymore. And some people may ask themselves why. And the answer is very simple. Like many shrewd politicians, he runs his own public opinion surveys because he wants to be attuned to what people think and what people feel about the situation. What his surveys indicate is that the level of anger and frustration on the part of the Israeli public is beyond imagination. People are angry. People are angry in America too. There's a whole genre of rants on YouTube, which I would be more than happy to share with the students, of Americans, very prominent Americans, Cardi B, for example, ranting about the situation very authentically, very effectively. And if Trump is not going to change the way he manages the crisis, this could definitely be his downfall, the way he handled the crisis so far. So this is really the context of which we're going to live in the months and possibly even years after the restrictions will be lifted. Now, it's important for me to say the restrictions will be lifted, but there is not going to be vaccination for COVID-19. Most of the diseases that we know, most of them, have no cure. The best that we can aspire for at this time is a vaccination, and the experts are telling us that it's not going to happen within the next couple of months. The best case scenario talks about 18 months from now for vaccination. So until then, social distancing, informational distancing, that's going to be the new abnormal. Now, we all know how economy and society evolved over time. And, we all know that we went from an agrarian society to industrial society to technological society. We're in the second stage of the technological society, which is called the revolution, the information revolution. The information revolution is standing on three legs: automation, artificial intelligence, knowledge. The ability to know, creativity and knowledge became the number one commodity. And then, of course, the information side of it, which is very, very exciting, because if you look at what the information revolution is all about, you see 5 very, very unique characteristics. The first is the volume of data. And this has to inform everything that we do from now on, and I'll explain why in a second. Even before COVID-19, the humankind produced an unprecedented degree of information. The new information that is being created, imagine the entire Library of Congress doubling its size every day. That's more or less the kind of information that humans produce. We do it individually, we do it in groups, we do it unknowingly sometimes, we do it passively. So when you go on a navigation software, you're actually creating information. When you're choosing a movie on Netflix, you're creating a new piece of information. Now, there are companies that specialize in collecting all those data points about our behavior. And then based on that collection and analysis of our behavior, they're able to predict our behavior, which is a very, very important thing. When you consume content today on YouTube or any other platform, you should know that every decision that you make is being calculated somewhere. And that calculation is allowing that platform to make a more accurate prediction. This is the strength of the algorithm. The second thing that the information revolution did is gave us unprecedented access to this information, right? In the old days, there was a lot of information that was not accessible to us. We had to physically go to a library and then search for the book. And how many books I wanted to find and I couldn't find, only because I didn't know how to find them in the huge library at Tel Aviv University. And then the third element is the speed, right? In the old days, when I joined the Foreign Service, it took me 3 weeks to prepare one document, to translate it from Italian to Hebrew. 3 weeks. Today, 5 seconds. Google Translate can translate the document from Italian to Hebrew. And of course, self-designed feed, which is the fact that we no longer work vis-a-vis an individual. No one is determining what's important to us. We are the ones who determine what's important to ourselves. In other words, we create our own set of priorities. And lastly, I spoke about the predictive segmentation, but what happened after 2 months of intense usage of the digital platforms, what we call hyperconnectivity, right? So there's regular connectivity, but what happened during COVID-19 is hyperconnectivity, which means that during a span of a whole month, I would spend on average 3 days using my devices per day, 3 hours per day using my devices, my smartphone or my laptop. Then during the COVID-19 crisis, this went up probably to 12 hours a day. So what happens to the ability of the algorithm to predict our behavior? It improved tenfold probably, which means that this is going to be the most common marketing platform known to mankind post-COVID-19. This is going to be the new way people communicate. You will see very little investment in old-fashioned advertising campaigns, but you will see a lot more money spent on what we call targeted advertisement. I can tell you that it's already happening now. During the crisis, I see that I'm being victimized, quote unquote, by advertisers that follow me from one device to another. If you search for one thing, if you watch a certain movie on YouTube, they already know what you're into and they follow you with their products, with their services, following you from one device to another, which is freaking, it freaks me out. It's kind of, it's even strange, but that's the way it's going to be and we have to get used to it. So as I said before, this is the old contract and this is the new contract. If you can see the mouse, right? This is the old contract and this is the new contract. The new contract will have to be based on what we call flex economy. Flex economy has a very strong element of gig economy, meaning freelance economy, very high level of mobility, and a very important thing, massive debt. Now, are you familiar with the concept of the New Deal? After the 1929 economic crisis in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the only president that was elected to 4 terms, he died right in the beginning of his 4th term, but during his first 3 terms, he really overhauled and changed the American economy by introducing and implementing the New Deal. What was the New Deal? The New Deal was something that he did against the advice of most economists, right? When America was broke, when the government had no money, the government decided to invest heavily in nationwide infrastructure. So when you go to America today and you look at all the big bridges in New York and elsewhere, and you see all those amazing tunnels and all those skyscrapers from the Chrysler Building to Empire State Building, you should know, these were all built during the time of the New Deal. And so a lot of people claim, and I would be one of them, that one of the ways to secure the future economic stability of the world will be a massive investment in a new Deal. This is the time for leaders to work against their instinct. Their instinct is always to avoid debt. But debt is only a theoretical concept. If a government is printing money, pouring that money into the economy, investing that money in the economy itself, and I'll give you a couple of examples of what governments can do with those investments, then the money goes back into the government. And if the government wants to erase the debt, it could do it. That's what the Americans did. Post-World War II, same thing the Americans did with what's called the GI Bill. The GI Bill was very simple. Every soldier that came back from Europe received a full funding for a higher degree or house. And that's the kind of stuff that will have to happen as part of the flex economy. What kind of infrastructure investment we can expect on the part of the government? So first of all, health infrastructure, obviously. But within health infrastructure, one very specific segment will be boosted, and that is predictive medicine. Predictive medicine is the kind of medicine that identifies in advance your susceptibilities. And for example, when a pandemic like COVID-19 comes up again, then instead of isolating and locking down the whole economy, you can only isolate the people who are going to be susceptible. The way to do it, predictive medicine, is something that costs money. The way to do it is for the government to subsidize the testing. And I'm not talking about testing specifically for the COVID-19 virus. I'm talking about general predictive medicine testing, which is already, the technology is available. It will require a great deal of investment, but it will save many lives and it will save a great deal of money in the future. Another massive investment is in transportation infrastructure. As long as oil prices, my dog in the back is eating something here. As long as oil prices will remain very, very low, then there's a chance that the travel industry will resume competitiveness relatively quickly. But once oil prices will go up, it will be very difficult for them to do that. So educational infrastructure. This is the time for governments to engage in experimental and expensive endeavors, making massive investments. The other side of the new contract is, of course, collaboration. The idea that governments have to work together, international corporations have to work together. Who's going to be, for example, who's going to draft the new hygiene standard post-COVID-19? Let's say you go to a hotel, you board an airplane. There will have to be a standard that the international community will have to agree on, a standard of what will it take for them to clear a passenger, to enter a hotel room, to enter a restaurant, to board an airplane. All those things require international collaboration. If there is not going to be international collaboration, it's going to be very, very difficult for the economy to restore itself. And then lastly, the last element of the new contract is the ability to redeploy employees from one sector to another. For example, housekeepers in hotels that are jobless right now could be theoretically trained very quickly to assume positions in the healthcare industry that is now short in human resources. And the ability of economies to move employees from one sector to another very, very quickly, I think will be also a key in the ability to turn this new contract into a reality. A lot of people tell me I'm naive, but I believe that they have no other choice. If they will not collaborate, if they will not share information, if they will not work together, there is no chance. I want you to consider one thing. France with 80 million tourists a year, Spain with 70 million tourists a year. Tourism is about 30% of Spain's economy. If there is no scenario, in my mind, there is no scenario that Spain is just going to drop that. No way in the world. Even in Israel, the tourism industry, then we're getting only 5 million tourists a year, but the tourism industry in Israel is the largest industry in the country. There is no way in the world that Israel is just going to drop tourism. It's not going to happen. and the country will have to subsidize it. The government will have to flood the system with money. The money will go to fix the hotels, to build new infrastructure, to make sure that the cities are clean and tidy. And if you attended the talk, the amazing, brilliant talk of Professor Call, he spoke about the fact that when your national reputation is strong, your recovery time is shorter. So for example, Japan, that has pristine reputation as a clean country with a very high level of hygiene, will have a very easy time recovering from the crisis, as opposed to a place like Italy that doesn't have a strong reputation, has a reputation as a messy place, disorganized, with a lot of disobedience. And this is exactly what happened in Italy. Same problem exists in Greece, in Spain, and surprisingly, Israel's reputation in the world is actually much better than we think in that regard. This is just an example of what the Americans were able to build during the New Deal. And one last example before I open this to the questions of the students or the audience. Just one example of what happens when leadership is working against its own instinct, right? I said before, government's instinct is to cut the budget. Government's instinct is to cut the marketing budget to avoid debt. For many, many years, economists told us in the Israeli government that the idea of desalinization is not cost effective. That, yeah, Israel suffers from shortage of water, and in the case of Israel, it was an existential threat. But they said, the economists said, it's cheaper to buy water from Turkey than to produce the water yourself. And then what happened was, about 15 years ago, I think it was under Ariel Sharon's government, there was a crisis with Turkey, and we couldn't buy water from Turkey. And all of a sudden, we faced a real situation. There was no water in the Sea of Galilee. And the government, against the advice of the economists and against its own instinct, decided, despite of the fact that it was a very costly endeavor that did not make any economic sense, the government decided to allow desalinization. And today we have 5 desalinization plants, and Israel is 100% self-sufficient and independent. We produce all the water that we need, and more than that, we give water to Jordan, actually more than we have to. We have to give Jordan a certain amount of water every year, according to the peace treaty between us from 1994. But we give them more water than we have to. Why? Because they need that. They use that water to provide to the Syrian refugees along the Jordanian-Syrian border, which is a story that is very little known, that it's actually Israeli-produced water that supports the Syrian refugees along the Jordanian-Israeli border. Just one example of what happens when you work against the instincts, when you work against the conventional wisdom. This is one of those rare times in history where leaders have to work against their instincts and make decisions that are of historical proportions. And unfortunately, some places the leadership is not up for the task. But in some other places, like in New Zealand and Germany and other places, interestingly, mostly female leaders are the ones who seem to rise to the occasion. And I'll be more than happy to tell you what I think is going to happen in the United States. But that's basically it. That's my prediction of what's going to happen. It's going to be a clash, a struggle, a real struggle. In some places, it will be a violent struggle. People are angry. People lost the source of their livelihoods. I'm exposed to a lot of information because of the work that I do with big companies in America. And let me tell you, small businesses in the United States were hit hard. They measure the impact of COVID-19 also by trying to quantify the number of small businesses that will not be born as a result of the crisis. How many startups that were supposed to start, that were supposed to be established, are not going to, how much knowledge we're going to lose as a result of this? Your questions, please.
Ophir, I think you had your hand raised throughout half of the. So do you have a question?
So Ido,
No?
what do you think will happen in the United States?
So I think that the reason why the article that I mentioned had 165,000 likes in like 2 hours is because a lot of people understand what's going to happen. So there is going to be a big struggle between those two agendas that I described. I think that if Trump will continue to assume responsibility for the crisis, and if the economy will not recover, which doesn't look like it's going to recover until November, then it's pretty much doomed. That's my opinion, because Americans vote on the economy. They don't vote on foreign relations. They don't vote, for the average American. The thing is the presidency. What's the economic cycle? Right now, the economic cycle is very much against the incumbent. It happened before to George Herbert Walker Bush when he ran against Bill Clinton after one term. The economic cycle was against him, and the rookie Bill Clinton, who was young and unknown, was able to defeat a one-term president, a two-term vice president, a former legislator, former CIA director, former war hero from World War II, a person that had impeccable political credentials, was defeated by a rookie because of the economic cycle. So I think the economic cycle is working against Trump in a very big way. And then you have the question of how Biden is going to carry himself. By the way, look at Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo is conducting himself the way leadership should be. When we talk about what is the defining issue of our relationship with our leaders, our relationship with our brands, that issue is trust. How do you maintain trust? By being accountable, reliable, transparent, authentic, true to your purpose. When you look at Andrew Cuomo, he's doing all those things. He's true to his purpose, he's authentic, he's speaking to us without patronizing, is telling us the truth, or at least he's giving us the impression he's telling us the truth. He's not trying to hide anything. His conversations with his brother are authentic, which I think is one of the gems of this crisis, to see the two brothers talk to each other on television. And I spent time with him in Israel during the Gaza war in 2014. And I can tell you, that's the person he is. He's really that kind of person. He's very down to earth, very, very, how should I say, I don't want to use the word common, but he knows how to talk to everybody. And so my prediction is that the brand of Donald Trump suffered a major blow, because the brand was built on the perception of Trump the winner, Trump the victorious, and it's not what people are seeing. People are seeing a different type of Trump that was defeated by a virus.
Biden is quiet and he doesn't say anything. And if Cuomo would want to run, it will take 4 years.
Yeah. Cuomo definitely is now a presidential material as a result of this crisis. Definitely.
Right. But the whole American society, the culture has to change, because if previously they would go into not preventing because it doesn't make enough money, like they sustain the situation as it is so they can make money, now they have to change the whole attitude and go for prevention. So it will take some time to run this full circle of change of mentality for a whole nation.
Yeah, and everybody, they're already starting to talk about universal health care. They're talking about universal income, for example, the kind of basic income, because something has to replace the old contract. Something has to replace the old contract. I say the new contract will have to involve massive subsidies by the government. Let me give an example. Tourism. Governments will have to sponsor each and every tourist because otherwise people are not going to travel. Airlines are not going to fly half empty. So who's going to pay for the tourists? And this is, and I'm not even talking about, this is only once we have a vaccine. Until we have a vaccine, it's not going to be, no airplane will be able to, just forget airplanes. I'm not going to go into the tunnels in the Western Wall tunnels after COVID-19. This is not going to be the brightest idea of going in there when there is not enough ventilation. And so these are real problems. These are real issues. Who is going to clear hotels? Who's going to know whether a hotel room was properly sterilized or not? These are all huge issues.
So Ido, I always have too many questions after I hear you speak.
Okay.
So thank you so much, and this is really helpful. I guess the first thing that crossed my mind when you started to speak was that you said that this is worse than any war and it's unprecedented. But maybe we can take a look at how or what lessons were learned from the Spanish flu 100 years ago. And how institutions like the international sanitary conferences, which led to the WHO, could kind of evolve during our times as we try to pursue truth and intellectual inquiry versus these idiotic memes, which only perpetuate some of the negative messages that are out there.
Yeah, so the scientific community is already working, as you know. And one of the interesting things that I learned reading about COVID-19 is that the current mutation of the seasonal flu is actually the old Spanish flu of early 20th century. Mm-hmm. So there is no cure, only vaccinations. So it's very, very important to understand there is no cure for the flu. There's only vaccinations, and those vaccinations have to be updated. COVID-19 comes from a family of viruses that was identified already in the 1960s. I read an article by an epidemiologist from California who's been studying this specific virus since 1973. So those viruses are known. It's just that there is no cure. So what's going to happen is that we will have to wait for, obviously, the scientific community to produce some sort of a livable arrangement. We don't know much about it. We do know that those who do not develop symptoms can go on with their lives, but we do know that those who have medical conditions, previous medical conditions, are at very high risk. So we don't know much. Also, don't forget that with the exception of Iceland, of all places, no country in the world ran random sampling of its own population. In Iceland, what they discovered is that the death rate that COVID-19, based on random sampling of their entire population, that the death rate is no different than the seasonal flu. Let's hope they're right. Because if they're right, then it means that, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But there was no such thing done. Not in Israel. In Israel, they made a decision not to test. Can you imagine? No testing in Israel, other than the people that develop symptoms, which is insane. Because how else would you know the real problem? You need to be able to sample the entire population in order to understand what you're looking at.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So then it seems like the world is taking the self-first approach, and we all know kind of how that can downward spiral. If anyone's seen Plot Against America, that's the perfect example of it. If countries or institutions might not take your advice and self-isolate, then what does that future hold, and where will the knowledge go, and how do we come out of this? You know, if this American presidency continues and he continues to revoke visas as a penalty, you know, where do we rebuild those bridges?
So a reason for optimism is to look at what happened at the aftermath of World War II, right? So the world, after World War II ended, an institution, the UN Charter was drafted. The Charter of the United Nations is one of the most optimistic, inclusive documents that humanity produced. What happened with the United Nations later is a different story, but the intention was pure. And think about it. Think about the idea of countries coming together, creating institutions and creating platforms to allow them to collaborate. It happened because of the trauma that World War II created. And I think that this is the kind of moment that we will be facing very, very soon. And I find it hard to believe, maybe Trump is not the kind of guy to engage in collaboration, but don't forget that the United States is much bigger than its president, right? You have a whole, United States is the main hub of creativity in the world. You have the largest foundation of academic knowledge in the world, the strongest, most creative scientific community in the world. So, and they are going to do their thing regardless of Trump, right? So if Bill Gates is going to invest money in developing vaccination, you know that many of the things that are happening today are happening outside the realm of the government. This is one of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about new diplomacy, is the whole idea of the non-centrality of government. And I think that this crisis exposed the deficiencies and the weaknesses of governments. And probably people have a better understanding of what governments can do and what they cannot do. I can tell you that in Israel, for example, most Israelis today understand that the idea of appointing elected officials to run professional offices is not a good idea, because they just don't have the skills that they need to run those systems. So I'm actually optimistic. If this is not going to happen, if nations will retreat into isolationism, it's just going to be a very dark future for all of us. But I don't think they have the luxury of doing that. I really don't, because the virus knows no boundaries.
Thank you.
Ido, what about the assumption of the Chinese side, that basically it all broke out because of them? And I'm not talking about, and purposely, not accidentally.
I don't know. It's hard to believe because there's nothing in it for them. When the global machine stops, the Chinese economy is hurt, just like any other economy. And so I just find it hard to believe. I don't think anybody stands to gain from such a thing. Maybe a terrorist group, but not a sovereign country. Doesn't make any sense. My concern is what happens when people understand that. Just imagine if bin Laden was alive today and he was about to execute the 9/11 attacks, and all of a sudden he sees COVID-19, says to himself, what am I, crazy? Spending all this money, training all those people, so biological warfare becomes very attractive, unfortunately, in the eyes of the radicals, because now they have the proof of how effective this could be. Nothing brought the world to a complete stop like this tiny virus. Never before. So that's a very scary thought. But I don't think.
I'm sure that some of them are playing with the idea, and I'm not sure that governments and systems are really up to the point that they can protect everybody. I don't think that we are ready to protect the whole world from this.
Right. That's why I say that governments that are going to think strategically and long term, will have to invest in what's called predictive medicine. Even today, there are technologies that can tell you, just by using a simple DNA test or a simple blood test, they can predict the type of illnesses that you're susceptible to. And that will help when the next pandemic will hit, and the next pandemic will hit. It's only a question of time. It's not a question of, then those societies will be ready. For example, imagine if we knew what we know today about COVID-19 3 months ago, we could have protected the elderly. We could have protected the people that have lung disease. We could have protected the vulnerable groups and not lock down the economy, because the very isolation that was imposed on us destroyed the economy. The destruction of the economy, we don't even know how many people died because of it. Probably more people than the people that died because of COVID-19. But we don't have those numbers yet. We're in the middle of the event right now.
What about fair access to all? I mean, society isn't equal naturally. It's segmented ethnically, socioeconomically, et cetera. So how do you make predictive medicine reach those people who ordinarily don't even have their own physician or may not have insurance or whatever?
So that's what I meant when I spoke about flex economy. Flex economy, if you see here, talks about massive debt. Massive debt is created by the willingness of the government to print money and then to invest the money back into society. So, for example, if you say that in America, the virus is an equalizer, right? Everybody is exposed to the virus. Then imagine a situation where the U.S. government is providing every citizen, just like in Israel, by the way, every citizen in Israel can get the flu vaccine every year for free in Israel. Sometimes they run out of it. I mean, they don't have enough vaccinations, but theoretically speaking, we have universal health. So imagine if the US government decides, okay, it's going to cost us $400 billion. Okay, that's what's going to cost us. We're going to do it. So it's against the instinct of the government. It's against the conventional wisdom. It's against what the economists will tell them to do, but it's the right thing to do. And we are at that moment in history where governments and leaders will have to do the right thing and not the cost-effective thing. And it's a very tricky thing to understand, because people like Donald Trump, who certainly doesn't get it, because for him it's all zero-sum game. It's either I win or you lose. He doesn't understand the language of collaboration because of his personality. But again, I think America is bigger than its president, and definitely if he's going to be replaced. But that's the kind of stuff that will have to happen.
So
I'll give you another example. Another example is
but doesn't that translate to tax?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, think about it. It's a closed system. If you owe me money, and I decide that you don't owe me money, I forgive the debt. Then you don't owe me money, although there was no transaction. Governments can do the same thing and have done the same thing. By the way, they do it all the time with companies that go bankrupt. The taxpayer are paying. What is the bailout of 2008, 2009 that the Obama administration decided? This came out of the pockets of the taxpayers to support the big banks and the big financial institutions that failed. That was an equalizer, right? So now they can do the same equalizer, just the other direction. Education. So the educational system, we now know there will be a situation where the entire system will have to move to a remote model. All right, remote model requires a computer, requires some sort of a device. Who's going to provide the students and the teachers with the proper equipment? Again, this is what the government should do. And that's the kind of thinking that you will see. All right, folks.
Ido, thank you.
Thank you very much. This was actually, oh, we have a whole audience here, which I wasn't aware of.
Even boys.
Sabrina, you were quiet the whole time, Sabrina. She's not with us anymore. Where is?
No, I'm here. I just was muted.
Where are you, Sabrina? Are you in Tel Aviv?
I'm in Tel Aviv. Yes.
Oh,
I'm
God,
quarantined.
I haven't seen you in so many years.
Exactly. But it's a pleasure. It was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't depress you.
Thank you very much.
No, you didn't depress us at all.
No.
Yeah.
More eye-opening than depressing.
Yeah, I'm going to my hairdresser.
Became
now.
depressed, so it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to fix my hair. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.